My number 5 best chess game of the 1990s is Anatoly Isaev versus Anatoly Timoshenko, two players you've probably never heard of. Just the other day, Magnus Carlsen told another player you've probably never heard of, Leonardo Lubicic, that he's a huge fan of his games. Actually, all of these players are correspondence chess players. Although correspondence chess may not get the attention that over the board and even online chess games do, the quality of play and the depth of strategy and calculation is some of the best there is. Basically, you're getting the incredible game quality that you get from AlphaZero, but from human players. Isaev begins the game with pawn to e4, and his opponent responds several days later with pawn to c5. You've got to remember the pace of correspondence play. It literally takes days for the move to travel from you to your opponent by mail. This game actually began in 1989 as Glasnost was commencing, and it finished in 1991 as Ukraine declared its independence. So the players literally began as Soviet players and finished the game as Russian and Ukrainian players. After e4, c5, the players are going to travel the sharp path of a knight or a Sicilian. In over-the-board chess, I often find that the most experienced players try to avoid the sharpest lines because they perceive that the chance of blundering for them and their opponent rising in the sharpest lines reduces their advantage. But in correspondence chess, the players want the most complicated positions possible because the chance of a clear tactical blunder is reduced for both of them, and they want something difficult to calculate and evaluate so that their deep preparation and deep work ethic can make themselves felt. Now, e6, f4, this is very, very natural stuff, very theoretical stuff. Here, black has adopted the three-piece system right here. And in this position, bishop d3. Actually, today, g4 is commonly played, and I've played it myself. And now h6, bishop h4, and g5. This move, if you've not seen it before, seems very radical. The idea is to gain this e5 square for the knight and generally to gain a lot of dark square control. However, nowadays, this idea has become quite standard. At the time, though, I think that players really didn't want to capture on g5, and so white avoided the capture on g5, which probably would be played now. White played e5, a very direct response. This leads to captures on both h4 and f6, and then white plays pawn to f5, a move that looks at first like you might rip open the center of the board and create a tremendous attack against the black king, but actually f5 is kind of a positional move because it's forcing black to play e5. Now, this is a very interesting structure. In this position, black has two connected pawns in the middle of the board. I love it, but on the other hand, they've been forced to advance. They're not side by side, which means that there are going to be weak squares in front of the pawns. The light squares are weak, and white is going to try to blockade those squares and establish nice posts for the pieces. That struggle defines the next few moves. The knight pulls back, the bishop heads to c6, and this knight hops into d5. The knight cannot be tolerated, and black could capture in this position with either minor piece. In this game, the bishop captures on d5. Now, bishop takes, rook c8, threatening mate right down here. And now knight c3, b5, thinking about b4, and this is an interesting moment. If your opponent played bishop b7, how would you respond? Now, this is a very, very greedy move. You often don't want to play to capture a pawn that's in front of your king. You may just open lines of attack for your opponent, but it is possible to play greedily here and gain an advantage. If, for example, rook b8, you can take on a6. But in this position, there's a radical and exciting idea for black that gains the advantage. It is to castle, simply giving up the exchange. And the point is that if white captures here on c8, rook takes c8, the threat of b4 compels white to defend c2, and then that has given black time to get the pawns rolling. The blockade has been broken in the middle of the board, and black actually has more than enough compensation in this position and the advantage with an amazing center and really well-placed pieces. Great exchange sacrifice. In the game, white played the more conservative bishop b3 and better bishop b3. Queen c6, queen trade please. No thank you, I'll just pull back. Rook g8 and knight d5. After a5, getting the pawns rolling on the queen side, we get a trade and the bishop hops into d5, tempoing the queen. Queen moves over. Rook d3, rook g5. This move is actually marked as the official novelty in the game. Now, after rook g5, it's a good moment to pause and assess. We have opposite colored bishops, and it seems like neither player has a clear target. You might say the position is equal and a dead draw. It is true that the position is equal, but that doesn't mean it's a dead draw. In some cases, we know that the opposite colored bishops can be tremendous attacking pieces. So if at some point lines start to open up for the bishops, there could be a very strong attack. Now, if both players play carefully, that shouldn't happen and the game should be balanced and ultimately drawn, but we're going to see that only some slight missteps can actually create a virulent attack in this position. So after rook g5, we see king b1, king f8. The kings are both scooting over. Notice that black did not take on f5 instead of moving the king because of queen g4, a rare rook skewer which picks up oodles of material. So after the king moves over to f8, it is here, I think, that white makes a significant strategic error, that is pawn to c3. I don't understand why white played this move, but it gives black a hook on the queen side to open lines, and suddenly black immediately has the advantage. Pawn to b4, taking advantage of the hook to challenge it and open lines. White tries to keep things closed with pawn to c4, but now black has an opportunity. Great moment to pause your video and try to find the best move. Well, this is the first of many exciting sacrifices with pawns that black is going to make to open lines for this bishop. This is the most immediate and direct opening of that line. Pawn to e4 right here, sacrificing the pawn to open the bishop and take aim specifically at what is now a very weak point on b2. In this position, if queen takes e4, that diagonal is immediately felt after queen f2, and white doesn't have really anything better than resigning here. There is a tremendous attack here on b2. You could cover with rook b3, but after rook to e8, the pieces are pouring into this position, and white should not be able to hold it together. So after e4, white actually plays bishop takes e4. And now you could just capture this pawn on c4. That does gain some advantage too, but black plays a trickier move, a tactical move, rook to e8. This move actually immediately threatens to capture on e4, and then after queen takes, to play queen to f2 and win the game. Therefore, white tried to move rook to d5 in this position, because now if you were to sacrifice queen f2, would have a response. Queen to g2, although even this position could be played after rook takes g2, and black still has good attacking chances. However, after rook to d5, another hammer blow. I love this move, one of my favorite moves in the game. Pawn to h3. This move reminds me particularly of AlphaZero, who uses the wing pawn so effectively to advance, gain space, create new targets. After pawn to h3, and by the way, it's possible that this move on move 30 anticipated a winning move on move 37 that happens in the game. If so, that makes the move even more spectacular. I can't know if that's true, but it's correspondence chess, so it might be true. After h3, pawn takes h3 would lose, rook g1 check, and after rook takes, queen takes, rook to d1, everything is defended except, no it's not, rook takes e4, the stinger in the tail of this combination, and because everything is under attack, ultimately black is going to have one extra bishop to finish this game off. So after h3, pawn to g3, and black continues. b3, pushing open more lines. Now, if you try to keep things closed on the queen side with a3, then again, rook takes e4, queen takes e4, and queen f2, and because of the pawn on b3, there is no queen c2 and no defense. So after b3, we get a takes b3, and a4, pushing to open more lines. White would like to play rook b5 in this position, but it doesn't work. Queen to d4, taking aim at b2 and e4, and just winning on the spot. There's no way to hold everything together. For example, rook over trying to support this right here, you can just take because queen takes and queen takes b2 is checkmate. So after a4, white pushes pawn to b4. There is a trick here. White finally has a trick that could work out for him. That's queen takes b4, rook b5, trapping the queen. But of course, black's not going to fall for that. After b4, we get a3, the final pawn thrust to fully tear open those dark squares. Now, after a3, I'll mention that b3 has a refutation that is similar to the game, so check the notes if you want to see that. It's a very nice line. But in the game, pawn takes a3 was played, and this is a great moment to pause your video and try to find the winning continuation. The hammer blow that black selected is rook to g4. Boom! Tremendous move. This rook g4 move sacrifices a rook to gain access to the second rank. This move is decisive, or actually that's not correct. There is one defense. Sorry, it's almost decisive. In the game, it proves decisive, but even computers don't appreciate how strong it is right away. Now, I want to point out one line for white. Pawn to c5, queen to a7. Pawn c5 tries to stop the queen from getting into f2, but she can instead take aim at a3, and that's good enough. You're still getting the attack on the dark squares, and this is also decisive. In this position, if the king tries to run, ultimately what happens is the queen can tickle this rook right here, and the king will be forced over to the e-file, and when he goes there, queen takes d5, picks up the rook with an easy finishing attack here, and a bishop pinned right here. I'll put that on the board. So after rook to g4, white does capture the rook in this position. We get queen to f2. Now the only way to hold this square together is to pull back with bishop c2. And now black plays rook to e3. This move has a tremendous threat that would be apparent after rook to d1. It is rook to b3 check, and black is delivering mate. Bishop check, bishop takes a3, and it's mate in just a couple of moves. King a1, queen takes c2, and basically GG-yo. So after rook to e3, how should you try to defend? There is one narrow defense available to white. It actually is queen f4, and I'm just going to give a crazy computer line here. You can play rook takes a3 in this position. This is the strongest move, threatening mate down here so that white cannot capture the queen. Rook a5, rook b3 check, king over, and bishop g5. You win the queen. This probably made white reject this line, but winning the queen doesn't win the game. Rook check, king up right here, and now f6 check, king over to d7. Ultimately, white is going to have to give up the queen here, and then after bishop takes b3, queen f3, it looks for a moment like black is just winning because literally every white piece is under attack. But white holds the balance by throwing this check in to clear out one rook, and ultimately you'll have to give up the bishop on b3, but use that time to activate your rook on h1, and once the rook gets over here and holds all of the really sensitive points, white is obviously doing okay on material, and black needs to play for a perpetual check in this position, and black should easily give that. The position's maybe not dead drawn, but ultimately it should be balanced. However, in the game, white did not play queen to f4. Instead, white played rook to a5, holding on to this a3 pawn. And now, if black continues with the obvious idea, rook to b3 check, it's actually only a draw. King c1, check, and you can follow this line or other lines. And in this position, after king e1, you have a perpetual with the bishop going back and forth on these dark squares, and the king can't escape that. But there is an alternative to rook to b3 check. Can you find the winning move here actually played by black? The decisive move in this position is queen to g2. I mentioned that the inclusion of h3 and g3 would make this move possible 7 moves later. Queen to g2, and the point is to push the rook into the king's escape path. That is exactly what happens. White has no defense here. Rook to d1, and now rook b3 check happens after this incredible inclusion of queen to g2. king over to c1, and the conclusion of this game is bishop d4 check when white resigned, because if the king moves over, this simply forces mate on d2. A fantastic, fantastic attack that reminds me so much of those beautiful, beautiful games by AlphaZero in the book Game Changer. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. If so, please do check out the playlist with more best games of the 1990s or best games of the 2000s. Those playlists are sitting right on top of your screen.